It looks like everybody's good. Okay, so then, to recap from last time, I believe that we established a few things. I believe that we established some of the things we look at when it comes to two different documents. And just because they have secondary issues or secondary differences, it doesn't mean that they're not reliable at all, right? You remember my example of the time you guys were standing there and there was some sort of robbery, some sort of thing, and the guy ran by, and one of you saw that he was wearing an orange hat, but nobody else remembered the orange hat. One of you remembered he had a gun, but nobody else remembered he had a gun. Just because there were those minor details that you guys found different, it doesn't mean that nothing happened, right? I mean, that would be the most illogical thing, because one of you thinks he was wearing an orange hat, one of you thought he had a gun. Then we must. But all of you agreed that he came. All of you agreed that he ran by y'all. All of you agreed there was some sort of kerfuffle, and suddenly he's running by with money. You all agree on that, but you disagree on these minor details. The most illogical thing would be to say nothing happened, right? I mean, something happened. And even if all of the details that you all get, even if we can't square all of the details, who's to say that, who's to say, I love this experiment Christy and I once watched, where they set up a robbery. They had a group of tourists in New York. They set up a robbery. The whole thing was staged. And then when they're interviewing the witnesses, they brought in a few plants. A few people who weren't there when the event happened. And those people started to fill in false details. They started to say, I think that she had blonde hair, things like that. And suddenly, people who were there were like, maybe she had blonde hair. I think she had blonde. The power of suggestion is very relative. Okay, so minor detail differences don't really negate that something happened. Something happened, even if we can't agree on all of the details, right? There is room up here if you guys want this table. Okay. So I believe that we established that there was this fellow lived in the first century. His name was Jesus of Nazareth. There are very few historians today that will deny the existence of Jesus of Nazareth. That's not to say you can't find some person online. That's not to say you can't even find a book that claims Jesus of Nazareth never existed. It's just the universal scholarship of ancient history, of New Testament criticism and conservatism, is that Jesus existed. What he did, now there we have some differences, but he is a historical figure. I believe we established that he died by Roman crucifixion on or around Passover, outside of Jerusalem. And I believe that we established that his earliest followers, the very earliest Christians, believed that he was raised from the dead. I believe that we can show that all the way back here to the very, very early parts of Christianity, very shortly after the resurrection. Not, generations later, they started to believe he was raised from the dead. But very, very early, his earliest followers believed he was raised from the dead. That brings up a very good question. Lots of people believe lots of things, right? Some people have even died for their beliefs. Does that mean that their belief is correct? Does that unto itself show that their belief is correct? No. So just because we can establish that the very early followers of Jesus believed he was raised from the dead, that unto itself does not prove the resurrection, does it? We do have to deal with two fellows, Saul of Tarsus, who becomes the Apostle Paul, and James, the son of Joseph, who becomes James the Lord's brother. Now this comes straight out of Bart Ehrman's The Triumph of Christianity. Remember Bart Ehrman? He is the New Testament critic. You'll see me pick on him more than anybody else probably because he writes at a very popular level. You'll find his books at Barnes & Noble. You'll find his books very readily read, even amongst people not terribly interested in Christianity or so forth. So he's probably one of my favorite critics to use. This comes from his book, The Triumph of Christianity, beginning on page 42, Paul the Jew. Paul stresses in his letters that he started out life as a Jew, and Paul stresses that he was very devoted to the Jewish faith, right? He intently pursued that religion with zealous devotion. He was circumcised. He was a Sabbath keeper. He kept kosher. He was absolutely devoted to the written and oral Torah. Paul believed as a first century Second Temple Jew that one day God was going to usher in a new age, an age of joy, an age of peace, an age of love and prosperity for the faithful Jew. Paul found this Jesus movement, which existed in the early 30s, he found it a perversion of Judaism because they're going around claiming that this dead guy was the Messiah. What was Paul's reaction? What was Saul's reaction to the early Jesus movement? He persecuted them, didn't he? He persecuted them with utmost fury, going to the chief priests to get letters to give him the authority to go into towns to find Christians and to bring them back for punishment, right? Now, that's not just being against something, that's being truly against something, right? I mean, are there things that you're mildly against? And yet, Paul has this absolute complete reversal of his life. He joins the very faith he's trying to destroy. He completely reverses and transforms his life. He endures suffering for this reversal, including the 40 lashes minus 1, something that we have no reason to doubt. Now, it's not simply that somebody changes religion. Who here knows somebody who's changed their religion? I mean, that happens, right? It's not simply that somebody changed their worldview. You've seen people change their worldview. We're talking, though, about somebody so far over here who has good reason to stay over here, who suddenly shifts all the way over here and doesn't benefit from shifting over here. Now that would make you go, why? Right? Now Paul, as a Jew, is a respected member of the Jewish community. He has the ability to just walk into the chief priests and say, give me letters. You know, I mean, he's a person of at least some means. I mean, he was educated. How rich was he? We can't tell those kinds of things. But all of a sudden, out of the blue, he switches. He jumps to the other team. And not only does he jump to the other team, he becomes the chief preacher, in many ways, of the other team. Not only that, he suffers because he jumped onto that team. Not only that, his fellow countrymen now regard him as a Benedict Arnold, now, accuse him of treason and heresy and so forth, right? What was it that got Saul the persecutor to become Paul the preacher?
Met Christ.
He met Christ. According to him himself, he saw the risen Lord. Do we have any reason to doubt him? One of the most interesting things is we have nothing in the early 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century that suggests he was somehow a plant, that suggests he was somehow a spy, that suggests he wasn't truly a Christian or anything like that. It's not until about the 3rd or the 4th century we get a pseudo letter, a false letter. It's called the pseudo letter of Peter to James, where Peter, the author of this pseudo-letter, is probably a very Jewish Christian. Probably a very Jewish Christian. Still circumcision, still kosher, things of that nature. Who sees Paul's Christianity of faith, and if you're a Gentile, no circumcision, no kosher, and they see that as a perversion. Notice that letter refers to him as corrupting the Jewishness of Christianity. Not that he's a fake Christian. Not that he's not a genuine Christian, right? So again, we have to have a good reason to explain Paul's switching sides. Now there's this other fellow that we meet. Oh, I'm sorry, I should have advanced the slide there. Paul says that he saw Jesus alive, regardless of what believers or skeptics would say about Paul's claim. In other words, even skeptics who read Paul's claim, be it in the book of Acts or be it in any of his epistles, even if they don't believe in the resurrection, they still have to deal with the fact that Paul says, the reason I switched sides was because I had an encounter with the resurrected Christ. Paul's actions show that he really did believe that he saw Jesus alive. If you right now wanted to switch sides, okay? But I don't care what we're even talking about. Be it Christianity, be it politics, be it diet. You haven't been a vegetarian up to this point, and today you suddenly decide you want to be a vegetarian. Can I stop you from becoming a vegetarian at this moment? No. But let's just say that if you change, you will face persecution. And you do. You face persecution. Persecution that eventually leads to your death. Can anybody deny your conviction to become a vegetarian at that point? Do they have to agree with you? No, of course not. But they have to say you were absolutely convicted that for some reason it was morally right to become a vegetarian, and you became a vegetarian even to the point of suffering. Now this other fellow, James, the head of the Jerusalem church, Paul writes that James, the Lord's brother, was an apostle. Acts chapter 15, James seems to have been some sort of leader in the Jerusalem council. You remember Acts chapter 15 is the circumcision controversy for the Gentiles. Paul and Barnabas travel back to Jerusalem. It's the first time the church gets together to decide a case like this. Suddenly there's this fellow James, the brother of Jesus, who's an important figure at this council. James has not been an important figure in the book of Acts up to this point. James has not been an important figure in the Gospels. And yet suddenly, here at the Jerusalem Council, this brother of the Lord James is a very important person. The Gospels, particularly Matthew and Mark, mention that Jesus had some brothers, and James is one of the brothers named. John chapter 7 mentions the brothers of Jesus picking on him, saying, don't you want to be famous? Go down to the feast. People who want to be famous, they show themselves in public. Right? Now, I want you to imagine there are actual movies of the Gospels, right? Sometime in the 70s, there was that British, the Gospel of Luke. It's simply called Jesus. Jesus has this long hair that even when he's being beaten, it doesn't move. I wondered, was it a wig or what it was, And Jesus talks with a proper British accent through the whole movie. It's terrific, right? More recently, there's been the Gospel of John, which has Desmond from Lost being Jesus. And it's basically verbatim the Gospel of John. In all of these movies, or even if you just imagine the Gospels as a movie, James is barely a background character in 2 scenes, right? You've watched movies, you've seen these background characters. Sometimes it's funny to notice what a background character is doing if the movie's not particularly interested. You're looking around that movie. North by Northwest, where the guy's about to shoot, or the gal's about to shoot the other guy. A background character actually plugs his ears before the gun goes off. It's a terrific scene. Yeah, he's seen it. Anyways, so James is barely this background character in the Gospels. And yet suddenly, sometime here around the Council of Jerusalem, somehow he's become one of the main guys, one of the main leaders. What happened? What happened to do this? Paul says that James had a resurrection appearance. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, that's the creed. I passed on to you what I received of first importance, that the Messiah died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and to the 12 and to James. So that's the explanation that we get for how this barely a background character joins the movement, and not only eventually joins the movement, but also becomes one of the main people. One of the interesting things about 1 Corinthians, we have a couple people named James, right? We have Peter and John and James, and then we have the other James. Could Paul be possibly referring to one of those two James? Probably not, seeing how Paul says he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then to the apostles, and he singles out this other James as in not one of the 12, not one of the apostles. So this James. I want to point out that this event, James, the brother of Jesus, having a resurrection appearance, we don't get a narrative of it. None of the gospel writers tell us, it happened on Wednesday afterwards. At 6 o'clock, James sat down for dinner and something. We don't get any story about James, the brother of Jesus, having this resurrection appearance. It's simply presented to us as a fact. I want you to keep that in mind. I think that that's an important detail when it comes to this prominent figure in the church. It's simply stated that he had a resurrection appearance, but there's no story to that. Keep that in mind. Put a pin in that. We'll come back to that. Bart Ehrman. Now, here's one of the times, I just want to be fair, okay? I actually have a debate of Bart Ehrman saved on my computer to watch when I have time. The reason I want to watch this particular debate of Bart Ehrman's is because he's finally on the side that I would agree with. He's in a debate, did Jesus exist? He takes the position that Jesus existed, and he's challenged by this guy who claims Jesus didn't exist. So when I have time, I'm going to watch the whole thing. But I watched this part of it. Bart Ehrman defends that Paul's letter to the Galatians, he mentions Jesus' brother James. The word brother there, it either means somebody who is biologically related, or it means somebody who is of the same faith. And in the context, it can only mean somebody who is related. So, here's one of those times, and what I'm doing here is I'm taking the critic. Okay, so Bart Ehrman's not an evangelical, he's not a conservative, and he argues that there was this guy, Paul talks about him, he identifies him as James, the brother of the Lord, and that word brother in the context must mean they're related. N.T. Wright, so we're shifting from Bart Ehrman on the left to N.T. Wright on the right. It's common knowledge that James, the brother of Jesus, became a central leader in the Jerusalem church. Since he'd not been a disciple during Jesus' life, how can we account for his centrality in the early church? Once again, this points to he had a resurrection appearance. Now that, just to get off on for a moment, who here has a brother? Who here has a brother, a couple brothers, or anybody? Now, do you happen to believe that your brother is the Messiah? No. I know my brother very well. He's not the Messiah. Do you know what it would take to convince me that he was the Messiah? If I saw him publicly executed, and then 3 days later he came back, That would get my attention. You know, I just have to say. Yeah.
Question is in my mind through this whole thing. If James is the brother of Jesus, why did Jesus turn his mother over to John for care?
That is a terrific point. So at the crucifixion in the Gospel of John, Jesus is on the cross, and Jesus says to the beloved disciple, "This is your mom. Mom, this is your son." Isn't that an interesting thing when we know that Jesus had brothers? Jesus' brothers were not followers. And Jesus wasn't about to leave his mother to the care of unbelievers. And so instead, Jesus says, "John, I need you to take care of my mom. Mom, John's going to take care of you."
So James believed after that.
It must have been after that point. You know? James's martyrdom. Once again, pointing out the fact that people have died for beliefs, so that doesn't of itself necessitate the truth of it. We have two accounts of the martyrdom of James. One comes from Josephus. The other comes from, if I pronounce this correctly, Hegesippus. Probably mispronounced that. He was an early Christian writer. I tend to go with Josephus' account and not Hegesippus. Once again, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. His account is very much more legendary. His account includes that James the Just went into the Holy of Holies often to pray. Did you hear that? He's saying that James often just strolled right in to the temple complex, to the inner court, to the holy place, to the Holy of Holies, just for prayer time. How many of you think that he could possibly be right? Probably not, right? So Josephus, on the other hand, is probably correct. Josephus's account is very basic. It simply says that once the high priest had the ability, had the time, got James the brother of Jesus, they stoned him. Very simple, not grandiose. The other guys, they throw him off the pillar of the temple. He doesn't die. They have to beat him with clubs. As he's dying, he's praying, "God, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing," stuff like that. And this stuff much more of later legend than of history, right? But once again, you have not been a follower of your brother, even to his death. Suddenly, out of nowhere, you become one of the main movers and shakers, one of the leaders of this Jesus movement, and you even eventually die for it. By the way, stoning does not sound like a pleasant way to die, does it? You just hope that somebody gets you in the head with one of the first shots, and it's a good blow to the head, right? Yeah, I don't want it, period. The tomb was empty. Remember though, let's not jump too quick. I want to put a pin in that once again. Remember that we don't have a story of James and Jesus' meeting. We just know it happened. It's just told us as a report. I want you to keep that in mind for a particular reason coming up, okay? The tomb was empty. Women are the first witnesses. In Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, we have Mary Magdalene as well as other women as the first witnesses. In Matthew, we have the risen Jesus showing up on a mountaintop in Galilee. In the Luke account, we have Jesus walking on a road with two disciples. In the John account, we have Jesus cooking fish by the lakeside, right? You put down Matthew, you put down Luke and John, keeping in mind that Mark ends with the women seeing the empty tomb and running off, right? So you don't get any appearances. What we get there in the end of the long end of Mark is dependent on both the book of Acts and the book of Luke and the book of Matthew. So anyways, you take the resurrection accounts in Matthew and Matthew and Luke and in John, and you'll notice very quickly there's a lot of differences. And yet, all four of them agree on this point, that it was women who discovered the empty tomb. Isn't that interesting? They have all of these differences, but they have this one thing in common. It was women that discovered the empty tomb. Going back to the 1 Corinthians chapter 15 creed, I passed on to you what I received. Christ died according to the Scriptures. He was buried and rose again according to the Scriptures. And then He appeared to the women. And then He appeared to... That's not in there, is it? In 1 Corinthians, as the creed, as Paul is citing this creed, he doesn't say he was raised from the dead according to the Scriptures, and then He appeared to Peter. That's the first person in the creed that He appeared to, right? Isn't it interesting that the women are missing from this very early creed? Now, it's possible that they were taken out. Oh, by the way, and this is Bart Ehrman. This isn't Ozzy's opinion. This is Bart Ehrman's opinion, that Paul receives this creed from the apostles when he visits Jerusalem. He talks about this in Galatians. I received this revelation. I went into Arabia. 4 years later, I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with the apostles. They believe that this is where he received the creed that is present in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Which means, if Jesus was crucified in 30, or if Jesus was crucified in 33, this creed is as early as 34 and as late as 36. It's a very, very early creed that Paul received. And yet, the creed doesn't include the women discovering the tomb. The creed says that first He appears to Peter. It's possible that this was taken out. They left this out of the creed to limit suspicion. But here's a good question I have for you. Let's just give, for the sake of argument, that Jesus was crucified in the early 30s, either 30 or 33. Let's just give that nobody is writing down a gospel until the 60s, until the 70s, until the 80s. Why, if the creed says that Peter is the first one He appears to, why some 30 or 40 or 50 years later do these people just making up stories all agree, let's put women as the first witnesses to the empty tomb? Does that make any sense? If you're going to just make up stories decades after the fact, why are you going to make up a story like that? It just doesn't make sense, does it? If we're just going to make up stories after the fact, let's have Peter there at the tomb. Let's have Peter, let's have James, let's have John discover the empty tomb. Why make up women discovering the empty tomb? I wanted to point out to you that, again, we don't have a James story. We don't have James meeting the resurrected Christ. If we're simply making up stories decades later, and James is this prominent figure in the church, why not make up a story of his encounter with Jesus? Wouldn't that sound better? Wouldn't that even give him even more legitimacy as one of the heads of the early church? That makes sense, right? I'm getting a lot of blank looks. If you read in the... Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped something. Women's testimony in the ancient world was regarded as less valuable. It's not that women couldn't testify in court, it's that they could rarely testify in court. And what we're talking about as a Roman court is basically you've got to be a woman in high position, married to the right guy, before you're going to get in to testify at court, right? Now, in the Jewish courts, it wasn't that women couldn't testify, it was only women could testify in low matters, you know. And their testimony wasn't regarded as that valuable. In fact, Josephus even says that women's testimony shouldn't be accepted. So here, the historian Josephus says, don't listen to women. Okay? So, why invent stories where women who aren't believed, who aren't given the right to testify freely in all court cases, why invent stories where there are primary witnesses? It just doesn't make sense. In the Gospel of Matthew, we get a very interesting story. The guards, after the women have gone off to find the disciples, right? The guards go back into the city. What do the guards do? They go to the high priests and they report to the high priests. What do the high priests do? They give them a certain amount of money and tell them, you're to tell people that the disciples came in the night and stole the body. You all remember this, right? In Gospel of Matthew. Now, a stolen body is a way to explain an empty tomb, isn't it? If you've got an empty tomb, you've got to explain why there's an empty tomb. And a stolen body explains an empty tomb, doesn't it? Why, if the Gospel of Matthew isn't written until the 60s or the 70s or the 80s, why over here invent a story that involves a stolen body? Or include the fact that there is a story already circulating about a stolen body and give an explanation of the origins of that story. Which makes more sense if you're trying to convince somebody? Why invent a story? Remember the principle of embarrassing details? When you make up a lie, you don't make up a lie that includes embarrassing details. That makes you look weak, that makes you look foolish, that makes you look, stupid, right? You invent a lie that makes you look grandiose, that makes you look like a good guy, right? How many of you had kids growing up? Or how many of you raised kids? How many of you remember some of the whoppers they ever told you to try and get out of trouble? Did they often make up stories that made them look foolish and made them look weak, or did they make up stories that were so outlandish that you just knew right away you're not believing? I'm not believing you, kid. I know that you're lying right now, right? Cookies don't just magically disappear off the plate. Leprechauns don't just come out of from under the house and eat cookies. There are cookie crumbs on your shirt, by the way. I mean, you know this, right? So, if we're 30 or 40 or 50 years after the event and we're just making up stories, why make up a story that casts doubt on your story? That makes no sense, does it? However, if we're 20 or 30 or 40 years after the event and we know that the enemies are circulating this story that we stole the body, then to include that in the text and to explain it away makes much more sense, doesn't it? If the empty tomb is a late invention, are you creating a story about a stolen body? Do you think that that's going to help your case? I just don't think that we're going to invent stories that are going to hurt us. I think we're going to invent stories that are going to help us. This comes almost straight out of Christian Origins, Volume 3. That's written by N.T. Wright. It's N.T. Wright looking at Bultmann. You remember Rudolf Bultmann from our The Great Divide class, and I was talking about how Rudolf Bultmann and Karl Barth are kind of the ones who led neo-orthodoxy and demythologizing the text. You remember this? The idea that the gospel, it has a kernel of truth in it, and you have to shuck away the mythology that's been added to it. You remember him, right? So this is N.T. Wright challenging Bultmann's explanation for the resurrection and for the empty tomb, right? So according to Bultmann, early Christianity began with no belief in a resurrection. Once again, does that even make sense? Once again, remember that Jews didn't have a dying and rising Messiah. They don't have a dying Messiah. So how can you even have an early Christianity with no resurrection? But let's just give him his argument, just for fun, right? So they started using resurrection language to say that he went to heaven. That doesn't make sense either. Because the Jews had language to explain this guy, he was a martyr and he's now glorified, he's now at Abraham's side. The Jews had language to describe going to heaven, to describe, a glorious martyr's death. Resurrection isn't that. Anastasis, the Greek word for resurrection, means a body stood up. That's what the word means. It doesn't mean a body went to heaven. But let's just give them it again. The early Christians didn't have a resurrection, and they started using resurrection language to mean he went to heaven. Okay. Later followers, so the next generation or the generation after that, they misunderstood their language. They misunderstood that they were using the word resurrection, but they didn't mean it. And so the later generation took that and said, oh, he was raised from the dead. Okay. Then, second or third generation of Christianity started to invent stories of an empty tomb discovered by women. Are you tracking this? Are you following his argument here? Okay, so let's just give their argument. Okay? We are now 2 generations removed from the cross. Christians are making up stories about a resurrection. They're making up stories about an empty tomb. These stories are starting to spread around, and non-Christians are starting to hear these stories, and they're getting worried about these stories. They're getting worried that this group of Christians is telling these stories. So we're going to make up stories to counter their made-up story. Are you following this? Okay, so non-Christians get worried about these stories and they start spreading rumors about a stolen body. And so Christians make up a story to cover for their made-up story. Are we getting into a deep state yet? I mean, at this point, the story that these Christians, second generation or third generation Christians make up, the story that they come up with involves the priests, it involves the guards, and it involves a bribe. Can I just make up a story about Kennedy today? I mean, sure, I could make up a story about Kennedy today, but how easy would it be for you to disprove my story that I just made up about Kennedy? I mean, there's this thing called the internet today, right? And if my story, bears no resemblance at all to Kennedy, bears no resemblance at all to events that happened in the 60s or so forth, are you going to start believing my made-up story about Kennedy? No, of course not. You're going to invent a story about the priests. You're going to invent stories about guards. You're going to invent stories about a bribe. What would it take for the Jewish authorities to destroy your story? Just the priests to come out and go, that never happened. We never saw the guards. We never gave them a bribe. Where are they today? All of this made its way into Matthew's Gospel some 30 to 60 years after the empty tomb. Really? Do you follow do you follow Bultmann's logic in him explaining this made-up story about the empty tomb? I mean, I really think, once again, if you're going to make up stories, you need to make up stories that are plausible. You need to make up stories that are not easily refutable. That's going to come back here in a moment, okay? Not easily refutable. The accounts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John are independent. You'll notice that in Matthew, it's Mary Magdalene and another Mary who go to the tomb. In Mark, it's Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Salome. In Luke, it's Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and other women. In John, it's Mary Magdalene. Isn't that interesting? Now, let's stop for a moment and ask, is there a contradiction? Does this necessitate a contradiction? No, it doesn't, because none of them say that these are the only people that showed up at the tomb. It's just, when you tell a story, do you give absolutely every detail? I mean, that would just make your story completely boring. We met this morning at Christ Church of the Valley. The inside temperature was about 69 degrees. The outside temperature was about 52 degrees. It was a sunny... I mean, if you're going to tell a story, you're going to get to the point pretty quick, right? You're not going to include every detail, especially depending on what your point is, right? Matthew has an earthquake. One angel rolls away the stone and the guards become like dead men. Mark, the women are bringing spices to anoint the body. They saw that the stone was rolled away and they saw one young man inside of the tomb. Luke mentions the spices, mentions they found the stone rolled away. There's two men inside the tomb. Mary, in John, finds the stone is rolled away and runs off straight away to tell Peter and John. Each gospel writer has a particular purpose in telling the story the way they tell the story. Simply because they have a purpose in telling the story the way they're telling the story, does that by necessity mean that the others are wrong? Not necessarily. Not inherently. It also points to, once again, independent attestation. Remember, I told you that when you all were standing there waiting for the bus and the guy runs by with the bags of money and whatnot, it's good to have more than one witness to an event, right? In fact, even in the Jewish law, you have to have 2 or more male witnesses, right? So when you have these kind of details, it tells us that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, whatever their relationship to each other is, because they do have a lot of stories in common, when it comes to the resurrection, we have all of these differences. And that's something to take very, very key note of. Embarrassing facts. Remember that the women... In Luke, the women find the empty tomb. They run and they find the apostles, right? And when they tell the apostles about the empty tomb, what is the apostles' reactions? Luke 24:11. Their words seemed like nonsense and they would not believe them. Once again, the principle of embarrassment. Are you going to invent a story? Well, yeah. Yeah, Peter goes to the tomb and he sees that it's empty and it says that he goes off. But are you going to include a fact like this that makes it sound like you're a naysayer, that makes it sound like you didn't believe? Or are you only going to report this because it's an actual fact? Once again, if we're just inventing stories, all things are on the table. Are we going to invent stories that make us sound bad, or are we going to invent stories that make us sound good? Remember Paul's 1 Corinthians 15 creed. If you're going to invent stories, all options are on the table. You can invent whatever story you want. Given the early hostilities between Christianity and the Jewish authorities, inventing a Sanhedrin member burying Jesus. Who is it that goes to Pilate to get the body of Jesus? Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph of Arimathea is described as being a member of the Jewish council, although it says that he wasn't part of condemning Jesus, right? Christianity begins, of course, as a subset of Judaism, right? Especially very early on, all of the followers of Jesus are Jews, right? And even very early into the church, it's still primarily Jewish, right? It takes a couple years before we even go to Samaria. It takes a couple years before Peter goes and preaches to Cornelius, right? So very early on, it's very hard for the Romans to tell the difference between a Christian and a Jew because the Christians are still Jews. In fact, you'll remember that in the book of Acts, what is John and Peter doing? They're going to the temple to pray, right? As time goes on, we start to add Gentiles to the church. Cornelius is one, and then Paul and Barnabas go off on their missionary journeys, and they preach to the Gentiles, and they're converting them. And members of the Pharisaic party say they need to be circumcised. The church comes together and says, no, we've decided that, that's no longer a part of Christianity, and so forth. So at this point, it becomes just a little bit easier for the Romans to notice the difference between a Jew and a Christian, especially a Gentile Christian. A Gentile Christian at the local bathhouse, you're going to notice something about him, and at the marketplace when they're buying the pork, you're going to start to notice, and especially as this continues. And Christianity begins to lose a lot of its Jewishness and begins to take on much more of its Gentileness, right? How many Christians died in the siege of Jerusalem? We don't know of any Christians that died in the siege of Jerusalem. By the 60s, by 66, the Jewish-Roman War started again. Vespasian is marching on Judea. Rome has had enough of these Jews always causing problems. Eventually, you get to the destruction of Jerusalem. The armies of Rome surround Jerusalem in a 3-year siege. Anybody happen to remember in the Olivet Discourse? Jesus and his disciples are there at the temple. They're inside Jerusalem. They're going out for the day. One of them says, "Hey, Jesus, notice all these great buildings and so forth." What does Jesus say? What? No, not that one. You're not far from it. Not one stone will be left upon another. You see these majestic buildings? The day is going to come that not one of them is left standing on another. And they go over to the Mount of Olives, and according to Mark, Peter, James, and John, according to Matthew and Luke, it's just the disciples come to him, and they say, "You said something back there about the temple being destroyed, and so forth. When is this going to happen? What's going to be the sign that it's about to happen?" And Jesus says, there's going to be rumors of wars, and there's going to be earthquakes, and there's going to be famines, and da-da-da-da-da. Now, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, flee to the mountains. Jesus says that to his followers, right? When you are a peasant, and an advancing army is marching on you, what do you think a smart idea is? There is a fortified city. Do you think it's smart to run to a fortified city if an advancing army is marching on you? Sounds reasonable. They have walls, They have things. So all of the Jews, as Vespasian marched on Jerusalem, all of the Jews ran to Jerusalem. The Christians heard Jesus say, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, flee to the mountains. Don't go back to get your cloak. Don't go back into your house to get anything. Get out of town. Get out of town quickly." We actually have Eusebius, a 3rd century church historian, who says that's exactly what the Christians did. When it comes to the accounts of the destruction of Jerusalem, we have nothing that indicates Christians were a part of it. By that point, Judaism and Christianity had gone their separate ways. Now, once again, we're some 30, we're some 40, we're some 50 years after the fact, and we're just making up stories. Are we going to make up a story that there was a Sanhedrin member? Remember, the Sanhedrin is the ruling class of the Jews. Remember, the Sanhedrin is the one that condemned Jesus. Are you and I just going to make up a story that there was a Sanhedrin member who took Jesus' body down off the cross and put it in a tomb? Is that something that we're going to make up? Do you make up stories that make a member of your enemies look good? No, you make up stories that make your enemy look bad and make up stories that make you look good, right? That makes sense. So are we really, some 30 or 40 years later, going to invent Joseph of Arimathea? Are we really going to invent a Sanhedrinist burying the Lord? No. Those kind of things just don't make sense. At this point, let's go ahead and take our break, and we'll come back and wrap it up. Sound good?